Hello, everyone. Welcome to QA number 3. It's 15th of April, 2021, 1:30 in the afternoon. And we are here today to talk about, this time we're going to talk about technology.
So we thought we'd kind of discuss the role of technology in our job and how it's changed over the years. Big changes in the way that we create music, big changes in the way that music gets implemented into the various projects that we've worked on, whether it be a video game, film, TV. And technology drives that. And, each time things change, it changes sometimes the way we have to work. So we thought it'd be kind of an interesting conversation to deal with. And afterwards, we've got some questions from one of our patrons. So I thought we'd throw those in and follow up with those. So to kick it off, first of all, let's talk about how technology has affected the creative process. At the beginning, when Barn and I met working together at Sony, well, it wasn't even Sony at that time, but they had pretty advanced, and they had a full Pro Tools rig. They had a very expensive mixing desk, near field and far field monitors. It was a very, very decent recording studio. And what we sort of did when we decided to leave and set up, we wanted to mimic that as much as possible, but we didn't have £350,000 to set up our own studio. So in the end, actually, we progressed onto a PC-based system that was a lot more cost effective, but we still needed plenty of outboard gear at that point. The Giga Studio didn't exist, and there was no sort of direct from disk streaming. So it was still very, very rudimentary if I compare it to what we do today. And of course, that comes with inherent problems, that when you want to recall an old session, you also need to recall all of the presets on any outboard gear, and you need to get everything set up again. And if you don't have auto recall on your mixing desk, chances of you getting the exact same sound are pretty slim to none. Whereas now, one of the advantages that we have is it's all in the box, and we can revisit old sessions and they sound exactly the same as they did when we left them 5 years ago. So really big advantages these days to the way that we work. I'm kind of jumping ahead. We should kind of track the changes and how it went. You were in games a lot earlier than me, Barn. You worked on the Amiga, and that was all prior to your joining Millennium Interactive and the Pro Tools rig. How was it in the early days?
Where I came from, the school I went to was fortunately a very musically oriented school, and they'd spent already quite a lot of time and money building a recording studio. And this is the 80s. It was running a Roland D50 synthesizer in 1987, and originally it was recording to tape. And they even actually bought an Atari ST running, I think it was Pro 24, which was the earlier incarnation of effectively what was Logic on an old Mac. One time was brand new Mac, and so I was already fixated with the notion of the mixing desk environment, the synthesizer, the samplers, and the hardware we used to go and to put the track together, get some microphones, go everything else. It was the classic studio setup, and but at home I had nothing like that, and I was very keen to write music. And a lot of my peers at university, they had a 4-track mix, which is effectively the most basic mixing mixing environment you can get. It uses the old cassette tapes, but it used effectively both sides at the same time. So effectively, you record 4 tracks, left to right and left to right on both sides. And you could even bounce it down by re-recording on itself and trying to get more channels. But effectively, it was a very rudimentary multi-track recording system. But my equivalent was the Commodore Amiga. I was coming from the Commodore 64, which was the 8-bit version, which had the sound interface device, a very, well, at the time, probably the most advanced home computing sound chip. But you move into the Amiga, which had 4 channels of 8-bit sample sequencing. And so it was a huge step up in terms of the realism, in terms of how things sounded, and just in general terms, it just sounded so much better than the competition, which at the time was the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo, and effectively, of course, the Atari ST. So in terms of music creation, this was a big step up. And as I said, my first game was on the Amiga. 4 channels of sample sequencing using a program called Sound Tracker, and fabulous. And that was it was all I was already in the digital domain. I was already not having to deal with writing down levels on a mixing desk and what settings were on a sampler or a synth or any bit of outboard hardware gear. I could just literally just load up a Pro Tracker or a Sound Tracker module, and it will come up as it was before. And so I was used to that instant recall. And
It was, just to say, it wasn't without its limitations, though, was it?
oh, of course, it was only 4 channels, 4 mono channels, and the Amiga was actually 2 hard left, 2 hard right. There was no panning between and the stereo field. Literally, it was 2 channels hard on your left, 2 channels on your right. So it was actually quite horrible. When you put it onto tape, if you like 2 tracks, put them onto tape. When you're walking into school listening to a Walkman, they would literally be like your drums would be coming out of there, and your lead would be coming out of there, and you basically it was pretty not particularly great listening environment for stereo, but. But of course, in terms of the fact that it was all sample based, meant that it just sounded so much better than the else. And of course, you were limited by the amount of memory. I mean, I think some of my early game tunes were maybe 100k, maybe 200 kilobytes. And of course, so that was the biggest limitation, is you couldn't record a great deal of you couldn't have a great deal of sounds, and you couldn't just sit there and hold a chord down on a synthesizer or any piano and go, that sounds brilliant, because that would take up all the polyphony. All the 4 channels were just 4 notes at a time. So yeah, you had to be quite creative in the way that you would make these make the tracks work. But the big step up, as Bob said, is when I went in-house in 1995 to work for Millennium. And now, actually, the reason I went to Millennium in the first place was simply because that did have the best studio I had ever seen. Coming at that point, I'd come from a university recording studio where they had 16-track quarter-inch tape, Ampex 456, and that was so. And I was going through a 32-track Pro Tools setup, which is the first time I'd ever really experienced hard disk recording, which is exactly as Bob said. The instant recall was there. Everything you could put onto you could record everything as audio files, and of course, if you just loaded up the Pro Tools session at any time later, assuming it was all audio, it would just sound exactly the same as it was before.
Well, it was a big step up, actually, compared to what you've just described with the trackers, because we went from a few hundred K for to store all of the samples within the tracker to 32 megabytes of fully expanded RAM on our Akai sampler, which was amazing at the time. We thought it was absolutely the dog's danglies.
Well, ironically, the Akai S3200, which was our main sampler, that's quite a good screen compared to some of the other hardware samplers, but it was still a small little screen. So in terms of actually the ease of use, it was still so much better to sit there and move a mouse around on an Amiga, record something in using Master Sound or edit it within ProTrack or whatever, and have it. But actually here you're having to you could see a little tiny waveform on this little LED screen, and able to sort of and turn dials to hear the start and the end of it, so you can work out loop points. So actually, in many ways, it was actually much harder to do. But of course, as Bob said, the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages, because you could play. I don't know. Actually, I don't know what the polyphony was on the S3200, but you could play a nice. You didn't have OS. You could just play it on a keyboard, and of course you would hear it as it was. And that at that point, which also makes it much more interesting, is that we can then load. We started loading CD-ROMs, Akai CD-ROMs.
But just before you move on to that, how much did they cost, the Akai 3200?
Oh God, that's a good question. I can't remember exactly how much.
They were like £1,000 plus, though, weren't they?
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Maybe 1,500 more, maybe even more.
And that's the point, though, is to think about just how expensive it was to buy a box like that, and then something like we had the JV 1080, the Roland JV 1080, and I mean, again,
I think it was £1,500 actually, £1,500 for that.
Yeah, and we bought some expansion cards and things like that for it. So you're looking at a couple of thousand at least, maybe get on for 3,000 with all the expansions and stuff that we did with it. plus the Akai S3200. You know, quite a lot of, just in those two devices, a lot of outboard gear. Then we had the Kurzweil synthesizer afterwards, which also had, I think, an onboard sampler. I don't know whether we ever really used that.
It was the K. It was we had the K2500R, which is something which we bought a little bit later, which I think we bought in 1997, 1998, and that was almost £5,000. But it had 128 megabytes of RAM, which was astonishing. And it was the high-end Kurzweil sampler, sorry, Kurzweil keyboard, the K2500, but in a rack, in the rack version. And but that was, again, because that was started to realise, and that when we had only the Akai 7200 with 32 mega RAM, we didn't have there was actually not a great deal of RAM when you start actually putting stuff in there, especially as I started talking about, we started buying Akai CD-ROM. So that's basically not only initially you could buy stuff which was just like literally an audio CD, and they were and it would be drum loops or some other thing else, and you would have to do all the sampling yourself, read it into whatever program you're reading it into, and then do all the moving and looping and everything else yourself manually, which obviously was quite tedious and didn't produce particularly great results. But when we realised you could buy CD-ROMs of stuff, which is folks had effectively already done all that hard work for you, it just became an easy case of loading it and then just making sure that everything, your MIDI and everything was set up, so you can sit there, press a button, and it would go bing, you know, like, this sounds amazing. So yeah, that made a big difference to that kind of, and it's especially, I suppose that's the difference as well, is that if we're going from the artist side to the media composing side, if you're on the artist side, you may have quite a lot of time to do this. And in fact, I would say quite a lot of the artists, that's one of the things which was their main strength, was that fact that they were making their own stuff. They were looping and making all their own samples. They were buying old vinyl from various places, and they were doing all the stuff themselves to make their own loops, which obviously sounded amazing, but that took an enormous amount of time. Now, and therefore you could, I don't know how, I wouldn't even like to suggest the amount of actual physical minutes of music they were outputting on a yearly basis, but it's a fraction of what we were effectively media composers were doing. We were working on sort of 3, maybe 4 projects in a course of a year, some of them requiring anywhere between half an hour and an hour of music. You are producing hours and hours of music per year. And whereas an artist might put out an album of music every 1 or 2 years. So from that perspective, there was a lot of the reason, that was one of the main reasons why we simply didn't have the time to go into the nitty gritty of making all our old drum loops and going sampling, because it's simply, I guess, I've got to produce a Fogger tune in a day.
Well, actually, that's a good segue into talking about recycle, because that was a big revelation to us back in the day, which a piece of software that would auto detect where all the transient peaks were in a drum loop, for example, and then you could effectively send it to the sampler, and it would create.
It would cut everything up into its individual bits. It would send it all down it would do all the programming on the sampler. It's effectively like saying, play each bit of it up the keyboard, on each semitone up the keyboard, and then it would also create a MIDI file, which would actually recreate that loop, and then you could put that back in your sequencer. So within a few minutes, you could effectively hearing a drum loop as one long drum loop, and you could hear it, and exactly the same in our sequence Logic Audio at the time, but every single bit was cut up. So that was the key to it, is that you're moving away from simply just triggering a loop to having the ability to reprogram the loop yourself. Now, of course, you're still using all the same source components in that loop, but the important thing is you're making it your own. It's not just simply holding a button down and going boom, 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 boom. That's it. I mean, that's obviously the easiest, quicker way of doing it, but we want to do a lot more. I've always been a big fan of drum programming, but as things got more complicated, it became just untenable to do it with the time frame. Because that was another thing as well. I'm going from the Amiga. I found it quite difficult to go from the Amiga to MIDI, because I'm so used to having everything in front of me on a computer interface. And on the screen, mouse and keyboard, I could see all the elements, and within ProTrack or Soundtracker, making what we talked about there as a drum loop was really easy to do. You would just load the whole drum loop, cut it up, and you would just then do it all within ProTracker. But here, you have to use a different bit of software, you have to do it on, and it was just much more of a faff to get it in there. But reality is that obviously once it's in there, there's a lot more control you have over it, because you're not limited by the limited 4-channel polyphony which we had on the Amiga. So it was a case of me finding a way of finding that ease of use which we had from the computer interface on the Amiga to something which you were within the MIDI environment. And so, as you said, it's a nice segue into Recycle. It was a wonderful bit of software written, funny enough, by a company called Propellerheads, who originally were in the Amiga demo scene on the same group, one of the Swedish groups. And so it was an interesting. So it's really fascinating is that you think about all the pictures you see on the of studios in the 80s and everything else. They were like, it was large, beautiful mixing desks, lots of flashing lights, all the tracks being played, nice positions and everything else, playing in beautiful recording studio environments, and racks of samplers and synthesizers and outboard gear. By the way, if outboard gear with it, we mean things which will process the sound, whether it be a compressor, a limiter, or I suppose most commonly people reverb, the echo things people like. That's the thing which most people would be able to recognize. But all of these things effectively just helping to shape the sound. But it's quite an involved process to make all this stuff to get it all together. And as Bob said earlier, if you're working on an environment where you've got lots of different outboard gear to process the sound, lots of different synthesizer samples to create the sound, as well as audio and everything else, if you've got all these levels across a mixing desk where every single element is mixed separately, you've got no way of recording that unless you literally write down every single setting on every single channel mixing desk, which can have different EQ, different level, different panning, as well as all the individual settings for the samplers and all the other bits of gear itself. So it became quite a faff. But something we talked about when the TED talk we gave actually was the fact that it became it's more about the barrier to entry. Whereas in the 80s, if you wanted to create effectively high-end proper sounding music, which would something you'd hear on the radio, it was generally very expensive to do. You couldn't do it without a studio. You couldn't do it without access to all the microphones, samplers, synthesizers, and everything else we talked about. You couldn't do it. Now, and that was in the 80s. In the 90s, things started going digital. You could muck around with things on the Commodore Amiga. You wouldn't get the same quality as you get from the stuff you get in a studio, but you could do something which was getting a lot closer than you could before. And then once we go into the Pro Tools hardware and getting into the whole audio recording or on hard disk recording systems, then we are looking at a lot closer. In fact, that's obviously these days most things recorded are still recorded and produced on Pro Tools. I don't know what the actual. I'm sure Nuendo things are taking some of that market away, but Pro Tools is still pretty much the default standard. And it was wonderful to have access to that system back in 1995, which was a lot earlier than most game studios. Pretty much every other game studio I've ever seen was still on a much more. Basically, they weren't running a proper studio. That's one of the reasons I came to Cambridge, was seeing this facility. It was like this is like incredible. It's just so much better than everything. I'm sure you probably had the same opinion, Bob, when you saw Millennium.
Oh, it was extraordinary. I mean, it was a big shock really to be there. I mean, when I was at university, we had a fairly decent little recording studio there, and it was all beta driven, and so it was all still tape based. And we got a pretty good sound out of it, but it was such a big step up to go there and work with digital audio, which was non-destructive. I mean, just having getting to grips with the concept of non-destructive editing was really a massive step forward. But I think we shouldn't dwell too much on the past. We should probably move forward to 50 years. When we went freelance, we had to set up our own recording studio. And what we did initially was try as much as possible to recreate what we had at Sony, because things hadn't really moved on dramatically within that space of time. Samplers were better, you could expand them to more RAM, but you basically still had samplers, synths, some software plugins, not loads. I seem to remember right in the early days, we weren't running loads of software plugins, not right at the start. But shortly after we went freelance, Giga Studio came out, and
No, it was Giga. No, it was Giga. It's called Giga Sampler first, and it became Giga Studio.
right. Well, yeah, but that was a massive change, wasn't it? I mean, then suddenly you could have really, really decent sounding samples.
I mean, I think that for me, yeah, I think I'm just jumping in. I think I'm jumping in here. I think for me, what the most interesting thing about what we did when you and I decided to set this up ourselves, as you said, we didn't have access to £350,000. We had about 30 from savings. We'd spent 18 months saving up all of the money we possibly could from various bonuses and everything else, whatever we could to try and to spend the time there. But the interesting thing is that technology had moved on so far in those 6 years from 1995 when I joined Millennium to 2001 when we started Bob One, is that actually for that £30,000. Now we obviously didn't have the beautiful studio environment. That's what a lot of the money went on at Millennium. But in terms of the actual our musical capability of our studio, it was actually greater. We could do more in the studio that we built ourselves. Effectively is in my third back bedroom in my first flat back in 2001. But the technology had moved on so much further that actually, yeah, we could do more. We could do more stuff, more channels and everything else than we could do with Millennium. Now we didn't have Pro Tools. At that time, Logic Audio, which is what we spent 6 years working on at Millennium, that was actually available for the PC. Didn't last long, unfortunately. But so, and I suppose also, this is the way Macs used to really annoy me. They still do to some degree. So I found I was actually very keen to move away from running Macs. So we spent all of our time building a studio around Logic Audio running on a PC. But we bought an EMU E6400 sampler, 728 megabytes of RAM that we had on the Kurzweil, but it was a much more capable sampler. For example, I think it was 64 note believing rather than 32.
You could actually make out what was on the screen as well. I seem to remember.
Oh yeah, it's a nice big fat screen, so you could see it. It was a wonderful. I think we actually bought. Remember what that zip drive for it? 250.
Yeah.
I think there were 250 megs or 200. Yeah, 250 megs per thing. So yes, and I had a lot of the. And in fact, I think. Obviously, I think all the samples were obviously the CD-ROMs that we were buying for the archive. They were also available on this EMU format. So the sounds which we were used to using back in Millennium days, Sony days, they were just as easily accessible. We bought a Roland JB 2080 rather than the 1080 we had at
and some expansion cards as well.
And expansion cards for that. And so yeah, and that was obviously more advanced, but again, a much bigger screen. So it's amazing how much how important that was.
Summary, it's fair to say all of the sound sources that we had, the synthesizers, the samplers, and so on, they were all better than what we had at Sony. And and the libraries that we were buying, the sample libraries like the Pete Seligman orchestral samples and so on, they were getting more advanced as well. And
the programming was getting more realistic.
But Giga Sampler was the big step up because that sort of it was a game changer, wasn't it, for everybody?
It was a massive game changer because exactly you went from having samples which could only be big as the RAM on your sampling device would allow, to allowing samples to be streamed from hard disk, which was obviously I can't even think of the comparison, but yeah, that's just quantum leaps in the realism. And the funny thing is about it is that when we first got it, we were just like blown away. I mean, you needed to run it on a separate machine. We couldn't run it on the same machine, and effectively a separate PC became the Giga Sampler PC, and you would load a library on there, and then you would effectively use your main PC, which you're writing on digital workstation, to just trigger the sound on the other machine. But yeah, we had large hard disks. I mean, I can't remember what the size of the drives were those days, but still, comparatively, I remember when we first played some of the string libraries, and I'm like, and I think actually for me the piano was what I really noticed, that we were very used to having pianos, which, and like the Roland piano had a very distinctive sound to it, but it was always particularly big. It might be 8 megabytes in size, but this piano was hundreds of megabytes in size, and it just felt so nice to play, because both of us being piano players, it's something we're both used to, the realism of, you can't ever move away from the realism of an actual piano. And so it was just like such a joy to do it. The problem is actually it became a double-edged sword for us, because as a result, it meant that our quest for making a great orchestral template to write for, which had grown from Medieval 1 to Medieval 2, and now we were starting to work on a game called Primal, and our synthesizers, our mock-ups, our programmed mock-ups, they'd taken a quantum leap in realism there from our previous one. I mean, like some of the earlier stuff, it just sounded incredibly synthetic by comparison. Simply because not only we were slightly more advanced, we knew what we were doing more, but the samples were just so much better. And they some of them they phrased actually sounded, so some of the string stuff just soared. It just sounded so much more realistic than we'd ever heard before, because you had the sample, because you had the scale and the size, which you could do whatever you wanted with.
But just to interact here, I noticed that around that time we were using fewer and fewer channels on the mixing desk, because really now there was Giga Studio coming in. We had the Proteus and the sampler.
Yeah.
So basically, I'd have sort of 6 channels, and then slowly we found ourselves not using the outboard gear so much, because we were having more and more libraries that we could use in Giga Studio and so on, and we're maxing out Giga Studio with Giga Sampler, and started to find some of the things getting redundant. I remember we weren't using, like, we'd spent so much money on the Lexicon reverb.
Yeah, we bought a Lexicon PCM 91 for best part of £2,000, because Lexicon was the de facto name in digital reverbs. Everyone was like, in fact, if you see any of the big studios, big studios, you'll see some of them will have effectively it's a white, looks like an old calculator, which is actually the Lexicon interface, how you control Lexicon. But all the big studios have it, because it costs thousands of pounds for these studios, but for these effects boards. But having a realistic sounding reverb was one of the the guiding principles of how good your music would sound, especially in the acoustic track, was having a good sounding reverb. Yeah.
I was going to say, cheap reverb can really cheapen the sound of a good quality composition. So you don't want to do that. But I remember, there was that sad day when we sold it secondhand, and we pretty much then fully committed to everything being in the box. And I mean, I don't regret that. I think it was a good step forward, but it was kind of sad to let these.
We did slowly but surely started selling all the gear. I mean, when the mixing desk we actually bought, even that was technically more advanced than the one we had at Millennium and Sony, because we bought a Mackie. It was a Eurodesk MX8000. So and funny enough, it was actually originally it went for thousands and thousands of pounds, but because the Behringer MX8000, and because Behringer had effectively copied a little bit too closely one of the Mackie desks, they had to sell them off really cheaply. So we managed to get this, many £1,000 desk for about £1,000, about a fifth of the price of that which originally came out. So, but it said 32 tracks, whereas originally we only had 24 tracks on the Millennium mixing desk. So it was already we had, and it was one that I remember having. We used to write used to get the bits of tape and write the names of what I was on every single channel and mix and everything all was piece. And as Bob said, we slowly but surely we started using that less, because everything was staying more in the box.
We should talk about the system now, because it's a very different story than what we had before. We've got, I mean, it's still not a pro setup in terms of, I don't have far fields, I work in a small room. Yours is a bigger room, but it's you still don't have far field monitoring. But we've got decent near field speakers, multiple screens. That's important because you're running lots of plugins and you want to be able to see the plugins on one screen, you want to see the arrange window on one screen, you want the mixer on the other screen, but it's all software driven these days. And we've got numerous plugins, synthesizers. I mean, back in the days when I remember when we bought the ES1, and
loved it.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
It was brilliant. But I just thought it's a nice gimmick. I don't see it catching on. And I mean, you fast forward till now, and we've got Nexus 2, Dune, all these kind of really great Spire, all these great synthesizers that actually they're real workhorses for us, and we use them as a matter of routine in things that we work on these days. And I couldn't see it going that way. I didn't imagine that that would become the sort of the de facto, but certainly it has for us. And Contact sort of replaced Giga Studio, Giga Sampler, and now everything runs in there. The library's got way more advanced, multiple articulations on strings.
I'm gonna have a quick look. I think one of our string libraries. I mean, I'll have a quick look at the just to give an idea of size here. Let's have a look. I mean, yeah, some of these libraries here. I mean, they're all multiple gigabytes, and I'll say some of the larger ones. Adagio cellos. That's from 5 years ago. That's just 26 gigabytes just for cellos. And so I'm trying to think of the really large ones. Studio brass. Yeah, some of these libraries are insanely large.
But the new fashion is to have multiple articulations loaded at the same time as well, as you would do if you had an instrumentalist sitting there. You know, they couldn't play on the trumpet, they couldn't play flutter tonguing and staccato notes and long held notes at the same time. So why, you know, they're trying to mimic more what the player is capable of. So one articulation at a time, and it works very well actually. But it means you need a huge amount of RAM to just cater for that. And our system's now running 128 gig of RAM each, mine and yours. And I know that, for example, the brass library that we've got, the audio, the audio, yeah, that library is, I mean, one of the presets for just trumpet, I think, was about 4 gigabytes on its own.
And that's to be fair, that's 4 gigabytes of RAM that's using up. So the size of the library is that's simply the size of the library is 150 gigabytes just for that one brass library. I think the largest library we've got is the Spitfire strings, and that's 196 gigabytes. And even their modern scoring string library, it's 122 gigabytes. So what they do is, if you're not familiar with this, they'll load the transit, the beginning part of the sample, into RAM, and then they will seamlessly move from what's in RAM to what's coming on the hard disk. Actually, using a technology which I believe was originally developed by AT&T for making voicemails. I think that was something to do with telephony. And I think somebody realised that would be really useful for this kind of work, and it's now become de facto norm. So yes, it's a huge change. I mean, in fact, the problems we've got these days are all software based, because if we find, because we'll find. So we talk about the fact that it's lovely to have instant recall, but it's not great if you can't run a session from 10 years ago, because most of the libraries don't work anymore. So that's the thing, is that some of them don't work, some of them are being updated, and you find yourself having to sit there and go, "What was that brass thing I used? What was that?" So in many ways, I mean, we do occasionally, and so we always, mix engineer does keep telling me, you should render everything out as audio once you've finished. But the truth is, you never get the time, so you never get around to doing that. But yeah, because obviously if it's all audio, then it's just going to go when it will load. The problem with being audio, you can't change it, you can't move it around, you can't move it. It's a fixed bit of audio anymore.
But it's probably worth just saying, as an addendum to that, is that the whole point is to try and increase the realism of, you know, whichever instrument it is that you're trying to emulate. But the truth of the matter is, they're still not as good as the real thing. Even today, you know, as you said earlier, you know, these digital pianos and things that we've got, still not the same as a real piano. They don't have the same kind of dynamic range. And it doesn't feel the same. You know, they're very, very, very good, but not the same. The same with, you know, any orchestral samples that you hear. Whenever we have something performed in Prague, you know, I think the demos sound great. And, you know, I'm sort of getting to the point where I think it won't sound, you know, how can they make it sound better? It sounds brilliant. And then they perform it and you go, ah.
I mean, I would say it's for me, the closest comparison to what we work in the music industry, as the music composer side, is visual effects. Visual effects, which moved from animating physical objects, whether it be spaceships or whether it be creatures and everything else, to going everything inside the computer. It's amazing, and I would say that's happened pretty much in the last 30 years, in the same way that music has moved more. And in fact, I would also say there's the other similarity is that there's a phrase in visual effects called the Uncanny Valley, where the more realistic something gets, there is this now there is you still know it's not quite real. And it's cool, and I don't know why they call it Uncanny Valley, but it's something to do with the fact that it's that sort of I said a lot of them said it's like dead eyes when you see like a nice, a computer animated face. They just look a little bit not quite there. Even though if you see a still of it, it could look exactly the same as the person they are creating an visual effect of. But when they're moving or something like that, it's just not quite right of it. To be fair, I think it's going to be a great thing if it does, because there was talk many years ago of I mean, it's something which we've seen a lot, especially in superhero films last few years, is de-aging. It's taking an actor and doing something which and having them do a performance of something which they did 30 years ago. Marvel have done a particularly good job of that within they did what's his name, Kurt Russell. They had him doing an incredibly good job in Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and I just recently watched a bit of Ant-Man, and they had Michael Douglas effectively from 1989 acting himself, but with his 1989 face, and he's done an incredibly good job. But he still doesn't quite do it 100%. So exactly the same thing here is that we've got these wonderful sounds, but there's still this gap between what we could do digitally and what we can do with the real thing. And hopefully there will always be that case. I know that well, I remember going to New York best part of 20 years ago, and the musicians were picketing outside Broadway because they were being fed up. In fact, they used the phrase, "I'm being replaced with Pro Tools." Of course, from the producer's perspective, they wanted to keep the cost of any production Broadway as cheap as possible, and the more they could have programmed, the more they could have effectively as a backing tape rather than having musicians, the cheaper it's going to be, because I'm going to pay for musicians every time. But of course, you're never going to get the same performance, which will change every time, because a real player will adapt in the way that a real player would, whereas a backing tape is literally hit play, it's going to sound the same every single time. So they were picketing about that. That was the best part of 20 years ago. So it's like anything else. Technology is a double-edged sword. For me, and for us, especially in our world, I absolutely love it. I would never not like to dream go back to writing music on the Commodore Amiga or the Commodore 64, because it would be such a step back to what it was.